right. So let's get started. This is something that an idea that Janet Gregory and I had a few months back that we kind of worked on and experimented with, and I'm going to share it with you today. It's still kind of experimental, and we hope people will try it and give us feedback. So as Sergio said, I'm on the Outsys's quality team, and I'm always available for questions or love to hear from you. So feel free to email me or contact me on Twitter. And Janet Gregory and I, over the past 20 years or so, well, not 20 years for the books. I've been a hands-on tester on Agile teams for the past 20 years. And then Janet and I got together and tried to share our experiences through books and a video course and also a live course that we offer through the Agile Testing Fellowship, and we have trainers all over the world for that. And then I also did a rare solo thing that I did a course for the Test Automation University, in Test Automation in DevOps. And if you're not familiar with Test Automation University, check it out. There's a huge range of free courses on every aspect of test automation and also programming languages, and all free. So it's pretty cool. Oh, and you see the donkeys there. My spare time, I play with my donkeys here in Vermont. So today I'm going to take you on a really short introduction about DevOps and continuous delivery. I know it's the DevOps group, so probably you all know this, but in case there's anybody new, and just make sure that we're using the same terminology. And then we're going to look at how something called the Agile Testing Quadrants model evolved. Originally developed by Brian Merrick back in 2003 when he was trying to figure out how do we fit testing activities into these short cycles of Agile development? How does this work? And then we're going to talk about how we can apply this thinking model to help us plan our testing for a continuous delivery environment. We try to handle both sides of that DevOps loop and apply them to things like creating our deployment pipelines and some of the benefits we can expect. And then of course we'll have a Q&A, so that'll be the best part. So just to really quickly go over my definition of things. So when some companies transition to Agile, I guess especially the larger ones, they kind of forgot about the operations team, and they got the business stakeholders and development teams together, tried to eliminate those old silos with QA and business analysis and bring them all together for cross-functional teams. But they weren't inviting the operations people to the party. So DevOps the term was coined by Patrick Dubois back in 2009, I think, or 2010. I sometimes hear people talk about a DevOps team or DevOps tools, and sometimes I worry about those terminology because it's really about the whole team, including everybody, our SREs, our platform engineers, the business stakeholders, the software delivery team, removing all the silos. And now we can have conversations, create shared understanding about what we're building, shorten our cycle time, get small changes to production faster. So it's a big cultural change. And this idea, I just love it. You know, we built the software, we run the software, we take care of it in production, we own it, and we do that together. We're not throwing anything over the wall to somebody else. So when we think about a quality-focused DevOps culture, we think about the whole delivery team and anyone else involved in getting our releases out to the customer and working on all the quality attributes of our products and thinking about all the risks that we want to eliminate or mitigate. And we need to be able to safely experiment and learn and think about our whole life cycle. What makes sense to test where? At what point should we do the different types of testing activities? What testing can we automate? What testing do we need our human skills for critiquing and things like that? So these are all the things we need to think about. So let's talk a little bit just briefly again about continuous delivery. I like this definition from Jess Humble and David Farley's book, Continuous Delivery, one of my go-to books still. And so, it's all about teams producing software in short cycles, making changes that they can get out frequently. They can release the software at any time. In the continuous delivery, we're going to make a human decision when we're going to actually deploy. In continuous deployment, same kind of thing, but every new commit that's made to our code base, once it gets through all the stages of our deployment pipeline successfully, it's going to automatically deploy to production. Now, of course, that's deploy to production, not release, because we can use things like release feature toggles to make sure we can hide changes until we're confident to start releasing them to our customers. So it's all about reducing risk. So just a picture showing one of the things that I learned a couple years ago from Abby Bangser that I hadn't really thought about is that even if we've automated all the stages we can possibly automate in our deployment pipeline, we probably still have some manual activities. We probably have some exploratory testing that requires critical thinking and human brains involved. We may have maybe parts of our accessibility testing or our security testing. There are things we can't automate. Maybe we want to have user acceptance testing. So these are part of our pipeline. These are stages that our code needs to go through. So we have to remember those when we're thinking about our pipeline. In continuous deployment, where we have the automatic deployment, now we have to really think seriously about how can we handle those manual activities. So we can make them asynchronous, and like I said, we can use things like feature flags to keep things turned off in production until we're ready to start turning them on, rolling them out. So I think everybody can understand that our continuous world, this is where we're trying to be now, and it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense of reducing risk and giving customers value continuously. But, for those of you who haven't yet transitioned to continuous delivery, maybe you were struggling to fit testing into like a 2-week release cycle or deploy cycle. How are you going to fit it into something where we need to be ready to deploy at any time? So let's talk a little about testing. I'm going to take you through a bit of the history of the Agile testing quadrants and how they evolved. So again, this is an idea Brian Merrick had back in 2003 of trying to visualize what are the different testing activities. How can we plan and think about all the testing we're going to need to do to make sure that when the time comes, we have the right people, we have the right skills, we have the right infrastructure to do that testing. And it's just a taxonomy of different tests. And so this is a diagram from our first book. And we have the business-facing tests. What's quality to the business stakeholders, to our customers? We have the technology-facing tests at the bottom half of the quadrants. Those are things that are more quality aspects that are internal to our product, to our software, that as the technology team, we're trying to build in. Then on the left side, originally, I believe Brian called this supporting the team, helping the team know what code to write. And on the right-hand side, now we've written the code, let's evaluate it, let's critique it. And these little clouds originally I believe they were added by Mary and Tom Poppendieck to try to think about what should be automated or not. And by the time we got to our second book, we dropped the little clouds because it was just getting way too complicated. And we changed supporting the team to guiding development. So these things on the left are how we guide development. And we started adding things like connectivity to that bottom left quadrant to show that it's not just about unit tests there. And we tried to give more examples of the quality attributes, these utilities, reliability, sustainability, performance, all those things that are important to us. And so we're trying to show that, I should say, we had numbers in these quadrants, Q1, 2, 3, 4. That was meant merely for the convenience of talking about them in the book, because it's really a mouthful to say, oh, in the quadrant guiding development with business-facing tests, it's just kind of hard to say. So we did that for convenience. In no way does that denote the order in which these testing activities are done. So just to make that clear. So in our most recent book, we evolved the model a little bit more, and the left side a little more general. I think the most important thing on the left side is that we take concrete examples of desired behavior and undesired behavior of our system and use those to turn them into executable tests that guide development at the unit level, API level, UI level, whatever is needed. And on the right-hand side, we evaluate the code that we've written to critique it for all kinds of different aspects of quality. And now that we have all these really complex systems, we need extra things. So we can't, it's even harder to have a test environment that looks like production. We can't predict everything that will happen, no matter how much discussion we have on the left side of those quadrants. And so we need to do a good job of instrumenting our code and writing data about the events and what users are doing in our system, so that we can have alerts when things go wrong, and so that when things we didn't expect to happen go wrong, we can ask questions we didn't anticipate needing to ask of our production system without having to add instrumentation to the code and redeploying. So that's where we get into observability. So we put that in that top right quadrant. You could make an argument it could be in the bottom right quadrant. It's no hard and fast rule about where these belong. It's merely a tool to look at and say, we're going to need to instrument our code. When do we want to do that? Where do we need to be thinking about that, for example? And talk about the testing that we are going to need to do to make sure we're ready. So again, it's a model, it's a thinking tool. It's just a way to visualize and have a conversation within the team, within your whole organization, perhaps. So, nowhere in these quadrants do we say, oh, no, it's the testers doing this. We're certainly talking about testing, but this is something for the whole team to discuss and for the whole team to take responsibility for. And we're going to plan testing at different levels. So we may start out by talking about, oh, what's this big feature set we're going to work on now, or even a brand new product. And then we can look at each individual feature, and we can use the same process for thinking about what testing we're going to do on each story. It's just a way to have conversations with a common language if people understand each other. So now I'd like to go through each quadrant, talking a little bit about risk and testing activities as applied to DevOps and continuous delivery. So this is kind of a new way that we're trying to apply the quadrants model. So we start with these business-facing tests that guide development. What are the risks from a business perspective? So obviously we have the functional requirements. What are we building? How are we handling errors? But what about third-party integrations or services interacting with each other? We can start identifying what to test and automate, things at the API level, workflow testing. We might start thinking about our exploratory testing charters. We're not going to do them yet, but we might start planning them. We might start planning what information that we want to write to our log files or to a data store like Elasticsearch, for example. So what do we need to instrument for the code? In the lower left quadrant, technology-facing tests that guide development, what are we thinking about? What risks are we thinking about when we're coding from a technology point of view? Operability, testability, maintainability, being able to catch errors if they happen. What low-level tests do we need? How much testing can we push down to that unit level, and using test doubles for external things to focus on testing that individual functionality, checking our logging, our telemetry. And in this business-facing tests that critique the product, now we're thinking more about business risks. So we may choose not to deploy to production immediately and have some pre-production environment where we can do user acceptance testing, exploratory testing, or those are also things we could do in production if we're using release feature toggles to keep things turned off except for our own use. So this is building more confidence. We've hopefully done a lot of automated tests using these examples on the left side, and now we're getting more confidence by trying to think, how will users really use our system? But we don't really know what customers will do until they do it. And so we may have to turn it on for some customers and see what happens. So we have our good monitoring and observability ready for that. Testing and production, I think more and more of us have to do that these days. Do some chaos engineering, for example, to test, make sure our system is resilient. And here in this last quadrant, not that it's the last thing you do, because you may, for example, want to test the performance of a new architecture before you write very much code. Maybe just write some throwaway code, test the performance, make sure it scales, as an example. These quality attributes are the constraints on your system. So what are your biggest risks? And if rolling out a new feature causes a problem, what's your strategy for dealing with that? How do you handle recoverability? Can you roll a fix out very quickly? Sometimes maybe you can diagnose the fix really fast. That's awesome. But if your deployment pipeline takes 45 minutes to run, people are going to be feeling pain until you get that out there. So maybe you have some other way to revert or blue-green deploy, things like that, where you have two systems going, one's idle, one's in production, and you can flip them back and forth. So again, those are just a thinking model to help you identify your testing needs. So let's see how we can apply those to our deployment pipeline. But before we do that, this is something I want you all to try out. So we're building an application to accept donations for our donkey shelter. I don't really have a donkey shelter. It's kind of a private donkey shelter, I guess. But let's say we have a donkey sanctuary, and we want to have a page where interested people can come and make their generous donations. And we're using Stripe as our payment application. So we're going to integrate with Stripe and use their API to do payments. So think through these different quadrants that I've just been talking about. And do you have any ideas for the types of testing you think we may need to do on this payment system? So for example, we might want to have some unit tests for the payment functionality on our side, but we're going to use a test double to mock out the external payment system because we don't want to test Stripe. We just have faith that it works. So think about, thinking about technology-facing tests that critique the product. Maybe performance is going to be really important. So I'm going to start my timer so that I time box this. Think about things and feel free to share those in the chat. I'm going to try to come look at the chat. Show chat. Oh, there it is. Yay. Would you position chaos engineering in the fourth quadrant? I mean, I think that's a possibility. It's definitely more technology facing. Yeah, I think I probably would put that personally. But the important thing is that you talk about doing it if you need to do it, and when would you do it? So this would be a good way to plan that. Any other ideas? If you don't feel like sharing them, that's fine, but try to jot a few down because it's really hard to have a good learning experience when I'm just talking at you. And unfortunately, with such a big group and limited amount of time, we couldn't do breakout rooms or anything. It just was a little too convoluted.
I'd just like to say that I have opened up. If any of you would like to say something, you can unmute yourself and interact directly with Lisa. Okay?
Yeah, that would be awesome. Or if you haven't really understood what I'm saying, feel free to ask questions. Oh yeah, the technology testing the integration with Stripe, definitely. Oh yeah. Oh, Manuel, I didn't know you would be here. But Stripe probably does have a way, they may even have a sandbox that we can find out about and use. The API tests, yeah, definitely in quadrants in the that upper left-hand quadrant. Security, boy, that would be a big thing, definitely. Yeah, that's a big thing, falling into the technology-facing tests that critique the product. My timer went off and it won't be quiet. Ah. Any other thoughts? Usability, right? Yeah, that's in the business-facing tests that critique the product. Usability testing, UI testing, user experience, making it as easy and fast as possible to donate. Definitely. Yeah, talking to the donors. It's great, great. All right. Security auditing, yeah. Code, I'm not sure what you mean by code pages.
That's an old lady talking. Back in the day when I programmed COBOL, we would call those code pages. I'm not really sure what you'd call that now. It's just like basically the different character sets that you have. So if you have people with Icelandic names, for example.
Oh.
Yeah, or very long names, which is not that's not relative to the code base, but yeah, that's kind of like a reality kind of thing. People with long names or special characters in their names and yada yada yada.
Cool. No, that's good. So yeah, why did we choose Stripe? And so that may be something before we ever chose Stripe. Maybe we should have been using the quadrants and having a discussion about what would be the best. Browser usage, yeah, looking at those browser statistics with the developer tools. Availability is a big thing. We don't want somebody to have a bad experience and try to donate and not be able to. How many users at once? Yeah, load testing. Excellent, excellent. Okay. Well, we're going to have another chance for y'all to share ideas. So I'm going to move on and talk about, I've been talking about how quadrants can help with planning your testing activities. And this is going to help you fit all the testing you need to succeed with continuous delivery or deployment. When we're actually talking about the infrastructure around this, building our deployment pipeline, moving our application to the cloud, it's a lot more than just configuring a few containers and implementing a CI tool, right? There's lots and lots of stuff involved. So not only the technical tasks, but also making sure that the team learns the skills and has everybody that they need on board. Or that they're trained up and everything they need to do. So there needs to be a lot of thought and experimentation. And the quadrants model, again, can help teams make sure that they're ready to take on these activities at the right time. We have a lot of technology and great practices to help us manage risk these days. And I'm not going to get into those today, but get people with different specialties talking, different experience. Use techniques like risk storming is a good way to identify risks. There are lots of ways you can do that. And once you think you know your risks and the priority and the quality attributes you need to test, then you can start talking about how you're going to address them. And I mentioned the blue-green environment. So one of my teams, we had the two production environments. One was idle, one was the one our DNS was pointing to. And of course, they did use the same database. That was a little tricky, but we would deploy our new release candidate to the idle environment and we dog food it or drink your own champagne for a day internally so that anything unexpected we might discover that way. And then when we flipped the switch and made that the active production environment, if anything caught on fire, we could flip it right back. So that gave us an extra safety net, which we did need. Because one reason we needed is trying to deploy more frequently, we couldn't figure out how to fit in exploratory testing. And the testers were not able to keep up with it. And so it turned out that we really needed to have everyone on the team have some exploratory testing skills and participate in that. We can use things like customer input to see how we're doing. We can do synthetic monitoring, white box monitoring. We can look at our CPU metrics and things, set up our alerts. There are all these different ways you can plan to manage your risks. And and again, that testing in production can be really important. So you need a safe way to do that, to get the fast feedback. And the quadrants are a good way to help you talk about these things. Oops, I was on the wrong. Okay, let me walk through this. Okay, I got confused what slide I was on. So this little visual, the colors are matching the quadrants. So the yellow are the top left quadrant, business facing test that guide development. The technology facing test guiding development on the bottom left are the blue. The green are the business facing tests that critique the product at the top right. And the red are the technology facing tests that critique the product on the bottom right. So this is a really simplified example, but you can see how thinking about which tests you need to run can be transferred to thinking about when they need to run and what environment you want to run them in. So, you know, Janet's worked on a team years ago that all this test team did was test the infrastructure. You know, today, well, infrastructure is code. We sure need to test it, right? And we have this wonderful ability now to spin up test environments with our deployment pipelines and run tests and bring those test environments down, and keep that code in the same version control as our application code, but we need to test that code as well. So that's just one way to look at the types of testing you can think about. And I took a little trip in the Wayback Machine to think about a team I was on a few years ago that we decided to go from releasing every 2 weeks to releasing twice a week because, you know, we were in the cloud, we had a blue-green deploy, and we ran into a lot of problems. If we would have had this discussion using the quadrants model for this, which we did use it for other things, we had a lot of automated test suites. We had implemented our CI tool. We were ready for the cloud, moving our hosting to the cloud, and needed to move our deployment, the process to the cloud. And some of the things that we kind of thought about in advance were, like I said, the exploratory testing, realizing that developers needed to be doing exploratory testing even at the story level because it wasn't going to scale to have two testers on a team of 30 engineers do all the exploratory testing to release twice a week. That doesn't work. Things like visualizing our pipeline design, like those images I showed you earlier. It's like, what's the value stream map? Where are we having handoffs? Where are we having bottlenecks? We can visualize that, plan that activity to make sure we're happy with our pipeline. Creating our alerts. That's in the more technology-facing thing. Just training people. We've got monitoring tools. Hooray! We got observability tools. Do people know how to use them? We need to plan time to train people in those tools. So there's so many different things we have to think about. And so what helps us build and configure our infrastructure, and what helps us use that infrastructure once it's in place? So that's just an example of how people could use the quadrants to plan. So I'm going to throw this back in your court, and going back to our Donkey Sanctuary payment donation application. Can you think of some tasks or things we would need to plan to do to make that happen, to help us move towards being able to release frequently, small changes frequently? And again, if you have any to share in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand and be unmuted and share in the chat. I'll give a little, set my timer again. I know that's a big ask. I gave you that one example kind of quickly. In fact, I'll just back up to my example here. Those are the kind of examples I thought of for that one particular team. So what are some examples you can think of apart from these for our donkeys? How can we help people help our donkeys? Test-driven development, yeah. Training the team. Absolutely. I think this is something that gets overlooked, that people are going to need time to learn. And test-driven development, that's a great thing to bring up, because that takes a lot of time to learn. So you're going to really have to plan for that. Collaboratively assess risks. Yep. Brad. Hi, Brad. Remove the bottlenecks. Yeah. Get the frequent feedback from stakeholders. Yeah, that could be automated. Ooh, I like that. Monitoring the rate of donations and establishing thresholds. So if things drop below a threshold, or we notice, or go above a threshold, we can have an alert for that. Really, really good. Infrastructure as a service for spinning up environments. That's one of the biggest advantages I've seen to moving to the cloud. Is we used to be fighting over these physical machines or even VMs on physical machines for test environments, and now it's just like, yeah, just spin one up. It's fine. Ooh, yeah, decoupling. How are we going to decouple deploy and release? What kind of strategy are we going to use for release feature toggles, canary releases, dark launches, progressive rollouts? Remembering to test the infrastructure as a service. Yep, that's really important too. All right. Thank you all for your good sports to participate in that. All right. So let's just talk quickly about the benefits. Just shared understanding of the risks that we have that we need to mitigate. What's our plan for mitigating those risks? What should our deployment pipeline look like? What do we need to have in our runbook so that anybody dealing with a production problem at 3 o'clock in the morning has some help? So this whole team approach to building a test automation strategy, helping everybody learn necessary skills like exploratory testing, security testing, performance testing, whatever is needed. As Jerry Weinberg is so often quoted, most software problems are, or no matter how it looks at first, it's a people problem. So we have to communicate. And I'm a big fan of the whole team approach because I feel like if we get a diversity of people with different experiences, different perspectives, I don't have any science to support this, but I think that we all have different unconscious biases, and that's why diversity adds so much value. So I'm missing some obvious thing that to Sergio is obvious, and he points it out. And then I was like, oh, that makes me notice this other thing. And so we can really take advantage of that. And it gives us a better chance of preventing unknown unknowns. But we have to be ready to deal with the unknown unknowns that we know are going to happen. And having these conversations helps us be ready for that. So to wrap up, just using a model like this, and there are other good models as well, widens out our thinking, helps us think more laterally, outside the box, prevent blind spots, prevent those unpleasant surprises, and build in those fast feedback loops that were mentioned. So how can we be confident to release these small, valuable changes frequently without stressing ourselves out? The quadrants are worth trying to make sure your team has a holistic and healthy approach to doing these small changes frequently, and being confident, being able to safely test them in production, do things like chaos engineering safely, having the conversations to identify the risks, brainstorming how we might mitigate them, a full solution for testing before and after deployment, being able to respond quickly to production problems and diagnose them, and getting fixes out fast or reverting quickly. So we've adapted these agile testing quadrants a whole bunch over the years, and a bunch of other teams have as well. And see if it works for your team. I would love to hear if you try it and how it works for you. So if you go to our book website, agiletester.ca, and go to the More Agile Testing book, there's a chapter on using models to help plan, and it does have other adaptations of the quadrants model that different practitioners around the world have done. And we also have a little testing and DevOps chapter. And then there's more in our later book. So again, feel free to contact me anytime. And thank you so much. And now time for the Q&A. So I will...
Thank you, Lisa. That was a great talk. I like how these quadrants can help us in more ways than we might normally think about them. I have a question that is maybe a bit more specific, question/comment around performance testing and load testing. I still see, and I was wondering if you have the same experience in many organizations, this is kind of left as a separate thing from our pipeline. And so it only runs when we really, really need to make sure we haven't done anything very wrong. But yeah, I just wanted to know about your experience, because to me, it feels like this should actually be something a lot more frequent that we can run in the pipelines, perhaps not for every change, but having the option to run some performance tests on a regular basis. But I don't see many teams doing that, which I was wondering if you have some experience.
It's a great question. I think it depends a lot on your domain, on your business domain, and how crucial performance is. Because some teams I've worked on, our architecture was pretty stable. We didn't think we were going to do any, unless we did something we thought might affect performance. We didn't do any major performance testing. But I think other domains, it might be more important to have them integrated into your pipeline, or at least into a pipeline, maybe not the production deployment one, but maybe one that builds for test environments. One of the things that we've done on teams I've been on is just try to build our performance testing in somewhere else. So for example, Postman, we were using Postman for API testing, and we would set thresholds in the Postman test. Like if this takes over 500 milliseconds, if this API request takes longer than that to return a response, raise a red flag so that we can investigate it. And some UI test frameworks let you do that too. So we kind of use those as, we didn't consider that to be actual performance testing, but just as a way to help alert us if there was a problem we didn't expect. So I don't know if other people have experiences to share with performance testing. Oh, somebody's put stuff in the chat. Oh, a cost. Yeah, that's a good point.
You have an interesting question about that was sent by Denise Hill. So there is a way to move from a dedicated tester role, so to incorporate the mindset of testing mindset into every developer. So how can we do that?
Yeah, it is a different, it is a mindset you have to kind of acquire. And it's also a mindset shift, even for testers that have been working in more phased-in gated environments, to really focus on preventing bugs rather than finding them after the fact. It's good to find them, but how do we think more about thinking about testability? And I think as a tester, being able to pair with developers, we've found that to be quite helpful to get the developers thinking, I'm pairing with somebody on some JavaScript for the UI, and they're working along and doing their test-driven development, which is awesome. And then I'm like, I wonder if we should try this maybe in Safari, because we're always working in Chrome here. And so just kind of getting that enlarged mindset. And one of the things that a developer I work with and I did was we created a developer exploratory testing checklist. And we had a little checklist of things they should try on it before they said they were done with each story. And we also had copies of Elizabeth Hendrickson's testing heuristics cheat sheet around, and a lot of the developers installed Goiko Adzeck's bug magnet in their Chrome extension so that they could try different heuristics and stuff, and just building that kind of consciousness of more things to try. I also highly recommend Rob Meany and Ash Winter's book, A Team Guide to Testability. They have a bunch of exercises in there to help your team work together to improve your code and make it more testable. And my experience is if code that's more testable, where it's easier to do testing, it's easier to automate the test, that's also more robust and reliable and maintainable code. So that's a good way to do it too. There's just exercises your whole team can do.
I will also add that I've experienced in a few companies that the tester is a main, I would say, person that executes a set of things and don't have the engineering mindset. How would you change that?
It's interesting. I've done a lot of workshops on what can developers learn from each other and what can testers learn from each other. And I think it's starting by having a common language. And I think one place, I don't believe testers all need to write code because we already have coders on our teams. But I do think that testers need to be able to have enough technical awareness to speak the language. I need to be able to use an IDE because if I'm going to sit down and pair with a developer, I need to navigate around that IDE, for example. And conversely, then developers need to learn some of the jargon of testing. And then what are the different types of testing there are to do? There's like hundreds, but what are the most common ones we're going to be doing on our team, and how can I learn how to do that? Exploratory testing. I think that's a great thing for almost anybody to learn. I like to have developers read Elizabeth Henderson's Explore It book. It's a nice short book. It's written with the audience of the whole team in mind. I've been on a team where we read that as a book club. Everybody on the team, regardless of their role, participated, and then we did the exercises in the book together. So that's an example of just getting people into that mindset and communicating better. It's all about being able to communicate. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. There are a few comments over the last topics that we discussed. I don't know if you want to read them out or...
Three amigos. I see Brad mentioned the three amigos. So Janet and I called this Power of Three in our first book, and then George Dinwiddie came up with a much more fun term. I'm a huge fan of that approach where we get a tester, a product person, a developer. And I think these days you're going to also need like a user experience designer if it's a web application, or maybe an operations SRE, somebody to represent the production side of things. You don't want it to be too big a group because you can't have the conversations, but then to use a process like maybe like example mapping or impact mapping to go through each story before we do our iteration planning. Make sure that we are all on the shared understanding. What's the purpose of the story? What are the business rules? What are concrete examples to illustrate those business rules? And by that activity, we may find, our story is too big. We need to split it up because it's really important to have small, consistently sized stories. So I think a lot of advantages come out of that. And even if you create those examples and create those scenarios, even if you don't automate it, by talking about it, you've gotten the shared understanding that the whole team can join in and appreciate.
You have another question before that from Alexander Matthias, which asks, Zoom is a little bit far behind. Sorry.
It's good that we have so much chat.
Yeah, so how, Alexander Matthias, how to maintain test the data samples, for example, API requests and expect output, and how many samples per operation do you think are feasible?
I'm not sure if I understand that question.
So you have that test data to maintain, and how do you
test data? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah. And how many requests do you think are good enough for an API to be okay? I think that's what Alexander Matthias answered. If not, Alexander, go ahead and mute yourself and ask it.
Yeah, I think you want to get as realistic a test data that you can. And I think that's really important. I was at a conference last week where somebody was showing how they did their testing using an in-memory database, so that it was a lot faster to get that data, to create the data and use it and then delete it. The in-memory database would seem like a really great approach. But yeah, I think this is one of those ones where I have to use the consultant answer. It depends. Again, this is something your whole team needs to talk about. What do we feel? How much coverage do we feel we need here? When I do an API, when I test an API, I want to test, let's pick one endpoint. I want to do all the operations I can on that endpoint. I want to test security for it. Testing without a token and make sure it gets rejected, things like that. And I'll probably do a lot more sort of exploring via, you can use a tool like Postman or even just curl requests to explore lots of different inputs and see what happens. But I wouldn't keep all those in the automated regression test suite. I would just keep the most basic ones. And one of my favorite things about tests is when I was on the Pivotal Tracker team, we did working test-driven development, of course. We took our unit tests for the API and we took the output of those unit tests running in our CI, and that's how we populated our help page, the examples on our help page. So the examples on our help page were always correct, because if a test failed for some reason, we had to go and see what was wrong with it and fix it. It's living documentation. So that's another advantage of automating. That's a little tangent, but.
The people, hi, I'm Alex. The people that do tests, such as myself and a few colleagues, we get really motivated and we talk about test automation as well. But then after a while, after like 2 months, then it's hard to maintain the data. So the question that I posted, and it's hard to keep up because you have a lot of APIs, a lot of projects. Then the project is in production. No one wants to spend time on that project anymore. So you can't just keep up maintaining all those tests, all those automated tests forever, you know? And for people like that, they abandon the tests. It gets to a point you just have to delete the tests because you have to do new projects.
So well, yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. You have this maintenance issue. And so you definitely want the minimum test you have. And, you know, what I've done on teams in the past is periodically budget time to go through the tests and do any maintenance needed. And throughout the test, we don't feel like we need any more. If a test isn't adding any value, let's say a test doesn't ever fail and you don't expect it will fail because it's testing something so obvious that nobody would go in and accidentally break it. Get rid of that test. My teammate, Joao Proença, had a great test bash home talk on why you should delete your tests. But I think it's a problem for the whole team to talk about. You need to budget in time. When I worked for a financial services company and we were working on a financial services app, our test data had to be completely redone every year because the rules changed every year. So it was date specific. And so we had to budget in stories at the beginning of each year to clean up to transform that test data and make sure our tests were okay. And we also had technical debt sprints where every quarter or every 6 months, no business value is going out this 2 weeks because we're going to go in and change our tests. And if we're changing our tests, we can't reliably change our code. So we have to wait. And those are big investments, but I think they pay off. It's in the context of continuous delivery, I think those things get a lot trickier, but you've got to deal with the reality of it.
Thank you. That's exactly what I was looking for. And the rules change every year, or legal requirements, the data itself, cross-referencing data gets really complicated. That's one of the issues.
Yeah, I understand. Painful.
Lisa, you mentioned a topic about code changeability and keeping up the tests running. What's your thoughts about black box testing versus white box testing? Do you think we should only test behaviors, or should we also test how the internals work?
Again, it depends. I'm used to working with teams doing test-driven development, and I feel like, and also in conjunction with that, doing using business-facing test to guide development, using behavior-driven development, acceptance test-driven development, specification by example. And I find if you do both of these practices, you've taken care of the white box testing, because as you've gone along, you've written tests even before you wrote the code, or as you wrote the code. So I think if you're doing that, those practices is sort of built in. I'm not sure quite how to handle it otherwise. It's definitely a good thing to think about, and it'd be interesting to figure out what quadrant that belong. Do you think that belongs in the technology-facing tests that guide development, or on the other side that critique the product? I'm not sure.
Yeah, and the question was more about, do you think testing breaks the capability of doing refactoring, for instance, like you mentioned?
Well, yeah, that you definitely want to have sufficient automated test coverage that give you confidence to refactor any time and not worry about it, because if you make a mistake, your tests are going to catch it. But it takes a lot of practice and expertise to get good enough at having those just enough automated tests to provide that safety net without being a huge burden of maintenance. And I think I see it over and over again, people don't put the work into designing the tests that they do into designing the work production code. They don't use the good design patterns and the good practices in the test code, or they, even worse, they hand it off to somebody on a test automation team that maybe they're decent. I was pretty good at writing code, but I didn't write code 8 hours a day. And so guess what? I mean, I did an okay job of designing my test code, but it wasn't what a programmer working full time on the team could do. And so that's where I learned to start, I'm really good at specifying tests. I'm not really great at coding them. So that's when I started partnering up, pairing with the developers. I've worked on teams where the developers did all the automation. And even so they used really sloppy practices on their tests. They had, they weren't dry and they just used terrible, or they have whole test scripts with no asserts in them. If you're not asserting, what are you testing? And so again, by having a tester and developer pair, we got a lot better result from that. So I think pairing is one way, or ensemble, or as we like to call mob programming now. If you have a tester in your ensemble or mob, you're probably going to end up with a lot better tests because you got that synergy. You need both sides of it.
Yeah, that goes back to the comment that Cheryl shared in the chat, that pair programming, pair with testers with developers help increase the TDD skills, for instance, in a team. You agree with that?
Definitely.
I just wanted to comment on that thing about tests without any asserts. We've seen things like that too, and I think it's because we have like this code coverage metric. That's kind of like we've got this Sonar Cube tool, and that's kind of like holding the keys to production. You can't get your stuff into production without this code coverage. And Sonar Cube is obviously not smart enough to know that if there's no assert, the thing is probably not testing anything. It's a wax figurine. I call those the Madame Trousseau tests.
Awesome.
And I think things like that happen because of bad metrics.
Yeah, metrics can drive some misbehavior if you're not careful.
Lisa, following on this, do you have experience on mutating tests, and you would like to share a little bit of it to address this issue that Cheryl mentioned?
I do not have experience with that. Do you? Could you share some experience with that?
Just by reading. But I would say that that's an interesting talk to have. Okay, following up the next questions. And hopefully I didn't miss any question. Most of them are comments, but how many interactions should we have to plan our sprint? From Duarte Castanho. For example, we have the 3 amigos, we have the 3 quadrants approach, but also have prioritization and other planning activities. How can we fit everything in only 2 week sprint?
Yeah, because we don't want to spend all of our time in meetings, but we need to have the conversations. So, I mean, in my experience, it worked pretty well to, at the feature level, we're going to work on a new feature set or new epic. We might have a brainstorming meeting about that and time box it to an hour. It's like, was that enough? We still have some questions about how we might design that or implement it. Let's have another brainstorming meeting. But we would time box them and have them over multiple days so that we had the time in between to think about it some more. In terms of planning, and then we would have more specific planning meetings, like using story mapping or something to start coming up with, what's our learning release or MVP release going to be? Walking through the walking skeleton of that feature and dividing it into stories. And then at the iteration level, having the quick pre-iteration planning meeting with the amigos, and some way to structure those conversations, like example mapping. That's probably my favorite way. But keep those meetings pretty short. You can get through a lot of stories in half an hour, or I would max that out in an hour. And then your iteration planning meeting is going to go a lot faster because you already have a bunch of business rules and examples, and you know what each story is for. And you've rejected the stories that aren't estimatable yet because they're too big, or they're too unclear, or there are too many questions about them, or we don't have examples. So I think it's making your sessions more effective. That's really the most important thing. And again, the more that you're collaborating by pairing or ensembling, that's a conversation already while you're doing work. So then I think then you have to have need for fewer planning meetings in that context. It just depends on how you're working. That's just my experience. So.
Yeah, Denise Hill and Antonio Howcroft, hopefully I said it right, are interesting in knowing what's the next big thing on testing and what's the exciting trend. What do you think about the future of testing?
Well, I'm really bad at predicting the future. However, what I'm hoping is the future of testing is getting involved in observability. We need to be able to explore production data and understand what is happening, both to get feedback of, we released this feature, is anybody using it? It's kind of on the analytics side. How are they using it? Was this valuable to people? And that helps us do that incremental thin slice approach of let's just do a small end-to-end slice, see what's going on. Should we keep adding to that, or do people not find it valuable? And so that side, and also the side of, oh gosh, most people, the app's working fine for them, but the people, in Brazil, they're having a terrible response time. Why is that? And being able to go and explore the data, because we've been gathering these context-rich, high cardinality events so that we can trace user journeys and see exactly what's happening and narrow down our problem faster. These are we have to ask questions, and what are testers but great question askers? I think that's what QA stands for, question asker. And so I really feel like this is a skill set that's necessary in the testing and production side, the observability side, and even the monitoring, setting up our monitoring. What do we want to what are the known unknowns that we want to track? So I think that's what I'm most excited about myself.
Okay, next question from David from London. There are quite a few things to cover based on your on the quadrants. Ideally, everything should be covered. In the event resource, if the resources are scarce, how do you prioritize each topic? Where do you choose things?
Ooh, if you have scarce resources and you just have to focus on things, I think you just have to work off of risk, like take a risk-based approach. What is going to cost the company the most money if it goes wrong? What's going to cause the most customer pain? And we're doing a process right now with our teams where we're trying to set what we call product quality goals. And part of that is identifying, what is our product? Who are our customers? How are our customers using it? What would make them want to start using the product? What would make them want to stop using the product? And by having these conversations, it really helps prioritize, where do we really need to focus right now? What should our goal for quality be to improve? And we know we can't do everything. We can't. My friend Ashley Hunsberger says, don't try to boil the ocean. But what is a small baby step we can take? And I think when I've gone to DevOps and delivery conferences, I hear everybody talking about, let's just do a small step at a time. I think that's such really good advice. But you have to identify what's the next thing that we should do. Let's design a hypothesis. Let's do some small experiment where we get results really quickly and know if we're going in a good direction. And if not, that's fine. We learn something, we can try something different.
This is a little bit like risk storming, right?
Yeah, risk storming is a great way to identify risks, and you can follow that on by delving more into, okay, we know these, generally we have these risks, and let's think more specifically about our customers and what exactly are they doing with this part of our product, and what's the most important thing we should focus on.
Okay, cool. I don't see any new questions on the chat, mostly are comments.
Really great comments. Oh, our mantra at Zoopla is, what is the next most important thing? How do we know? How do we do it with quality? All engineers, yes. And building the wrong thing, yep. That is very costly. We want to be shortening our cycle time, and I think that shared understanding up front is so important for that.
I do have one extra question. What do you think about where should we get test data? Should we get it from production and just, let's say we have a project that's 5 years old. Should we get data from production and just scramble the data, or should we start from scratch? what are the risks from going one over the other? What's your thoughts on that? Because there are a lot of legacy projects out there.
This has been a perennial question that my teams have faced over the years. The approach that my teams have generally taken is, for our lower level tests, create the data, let the test create the data, or have canonical data that we refresh from S3 or something at the start of every test script. Make it as realistic as possible. Don't use actual production data, but just try to have all the use cases you have in production so that we cover as much as we can. And then we might take a scrubbed copy of production data and get all the personal details out of it. And that's what we would do our exploratory testing on, because we're going to try to really think about how customers are really going to use our product and do our exploratory testing charters. That's really important to do on the most production-like data that we can find. But we do, as mentioned earlier, we get into all these problems with maintaining even our canonical data. Is this canonical data still appropriate, and are our tests going to run correctly and get the correct outputs? So it's an investment to figure out how to do it. I really like Ashley Hunsberger has a test suite canvas in her GitHub repo that has a bunch of questions like this, and one of them is test data, of all the things that you should think about when you're looking at your automated test suites. And that is one way to help you make sure your automated test suite just does the minimum it needs to do to provide you the coverage that it wants. If anybody wants that link, you can contact me later. I don't have it to hand.
Doing production, testing in production, there's no better place than doing tests that is production. But that scares a lot of people. Your thoughts on it? It
sounds scary. You can't just go out and say, let's do testing in production. You need to have the infrastructure that supports it. So you need to have done a good job of setting up your release feature toggles so that you keep things invisible to people you don't want to look at it yet. And that can be tricky. I mean, it's really easy for those things to leak, or people see things they shouldn't, or it breaks something that's existing. So this is something your team needs to practice at and get good at, and also be ready to turn things off or roll them back out of production if you need to. But it's really the only way to know. Very few environments can look like production except production. And the more complex and distributed our systems get in the cloud, the harder that is to do. I mean, I've never worked any place where we had a test environment that had multiple servers and a load balancer. And then, guess what? We deploy and we have a configuration problem, and we've broken something at the load balancer level. So I think it's something teams should think about. What problems can we solve with testing in production? What infrastructure do we need to build to feel confident to do that?
I think follow up on this question, Michelle asked something. Is this the reason why we need to do chaos engineering?
Yeah, chaos engineering, I think, and I haven't done it myself. I've, again, kind of just going to conference sessions on it and stuff. But my understanding of it is it's more to test like the resilience and recoverability and reliability of your system by doing random things of, we dropped this database table or we took this server out. And again, you have to have done a lot of work in advance to make it safe to do that. And you have to have really good monitoring, really good observability to get there. So unfortunately, I haven't worked on a team that was capable of doing that safely. But I sure would like to. I hope that we can do it someday at OutSystems.
One day. How many deployment environments do you have for your projects on average? How many do you actually test on a regular basis? So how many do you provision? How many do you really use them? So for instance, this question came from Alexander Matias. He said, we have 5 test environments plus production, but in reality, people only really use 2 of them. And well, your team spends time maintaining all of them.
Yeah, I confess I don't actually I'm pretty new to OutSystems, and I don't know exactly what's done at OutSystems, but on previous teams, this is a big problem. And one way to avoid the problem is have a stage in your deployment pipeline that creates your test environment on the fly in the cloud, a preview environment, if you will, and deploys that build artifact there, ready to test, either running the automated tests on it or doing some exploratory testing on it. And when you're done, you just delete it. And it's a gift. Now, a lot of times those cloud environments don't have everything you need. And so then you do need to provision test environments. But I think it's really important to be able to just rebuild your test environment from scratch by starting a script. And this is just infrastructure the team needs to build. And our cloud infrastructure tools have made it a lot easier to do. But I remember the days of trying to manually, our test database, I need the DBA because there's something wrong with the test database. Being able to just refresh the database from S3 or something and start fresh from scratch is really nice. Now, I've done almost all my testing has been on web-based applications. I have no idea how this works on embedded software or any other types of applications, if you can use the same approach or not.
So I would say if you're not using them, dump them, right?
Yeah. Legacy systems, yeah.
Is there anything that used to be common for testers a few years ago, I would say, that has fallen out of favor, and do you think that should come back?
Ooh, that's a really interesting question. What did we used to do that we might do again? Nothing springs to mind. I'm trying to think. I think for a while, when I first joined my first extreme programming team, we focused so much on functional testing because we were doing test-driven development that everything else went out the window. Like security testing, performance testing. I mean, literally for years, my team and we were so focused on functional testing, we didn't do any of those other kinds of testing. And before that, we did. So I think it can happen that you start a new practice and then you kind of forget some of the things you were doing before because you're so focused on learning this new practice and doing exactly what that book says, and you forget some of the old common sense things you used to do. It was a big revelation to me, like 5 or 6 years later, to go, oh, we need to do some security testing.
That goes back a little bit for the Manuel Pai's question early. So thank you, Denise Hill, for putting that question. Last question from Felipe Furtado. He said, hello, Lisa. I have a question about metrics. Involving the whole team is awesome when discussing metrics, dev, products, and testers. But how to keep balance? For example, balancing tested lines of code, a blind metric versus tested features, a more human metric. Any advice on this?
The approach I like to take with metrics is that first set a goal and then think, how will we measure our progress to that goal? And years ago, we used to do this like 6-month goals. Okay, in 6 months, we want to increase our code coverage by 3%. And so what we measure? Well, we need a code coverage tool. What is our code coverage now? And that worked really well for us, even though we were an agile team. But I think now things move a lot faster and it's more important. I learned a lot over the years from Linda Rising about doing small, frugal experiments, as she calls them. So what is some hypothesis we have? Well, what's our big problem? What's our biggest problem we want to solve right now? What is some experiment we could try to make that problem a little smaller? We come up with a hypothesis. We believe by doing X that Y will happen, and we will measure this by Z. And coming up with the measurements is really hard, but it's really important because we won't know if we're progressing towards the goal. So I prefer to do this in smaller increments. But of course, there may be metrics, things like performance thresholds and stuff that you want to totally maintain, but I think it's something you need. I think they need to be sort of living metrics. I don't like setting a set of metrics and then just arbitrarily, because as we mentioned earlier, they can drive some really bad behavior. So some of the things people do, I just feel like, what value is that really giving you? Are you really improving because of that metric?
So final question, what's your next big goal for you as a in the testing industry, I would say?
For me personally?
Yeah.
Getting the hands-on with observability, man. It's my mission. I want to really use these tools. I want to start exploring that data. So it won't happen overnight, but step by step.
And hopefully you are coming here to DevOps Lisbon to share again your thoughts on it.
Oh yeah, once we have some experience with that, Sergio, we'll come back and share that with everybody.
Definitely. Probably both of us. Why not, right? Well, I'd like to thank Lisa and everybody who attended this session. So great discussion. Thank you very much for the questions that you have been placing on the chat. Thank you, Lisa, once again for being here.
Oh, thank you. It was really a pleasure.